Welcome to another edition of Living with Purpose. Today, I have Degan Ali, somebody that I admire immensely. Degan has been part of the development community, working with people on the ground in Africa and around the world to help them live a better life. She is the CEO of Adeso, which is a nonprofit organization that is based both in Somalia and Kenya. But more importantly, Degan is a trailblazer, which is really focused on how do we ensure that development assistance money flows into the hands of people that need it most, that are on the ground. So please join me in welcoming Degan to the podcast. Degan, welcome.
Thank you, Akhtar. Thank you so much for having me.
Your story is so fascinating, right? I mean, I've listened to your story so many times now, and I think that this is something that people should listen to. So tell me your story, where you grew up, your childhood, the work that your mother did, her influence, and what you're doing today.
I'm originally from Somalia, and I left as a child and went to the U.S. because my father was a diplomat, and he was stationed in D.C. He was also stationed in Iraq, in Baghdad. So we went to the U.S. when I was about 9 years old, to D.C., and we lived in the U.S. and finished my primary and my secondary education there and my bachelor's degree in the U.S. And then the war happened while I was getting my bachelor's at Trinity College in Hartford. The war in Somalia happened, and my mother decided at that time to intervene, and she started this very local nonprofit that is now called Adeso, but initially doing a lot of advocacy work around trying to stop the civil war and the killing and the famine-like conditions that people were experiencing in Somalia. So as a diaspora living in the U.S. in this very privileged life, she just felt that she had to do something. And she was speaking in college campuses all over the country and speaking on media. And she was doing anybody who would give her a mic, she was ready to talk about the situation in Somalia. And then, of course, you know what happened. The U.S. government did decide to get involved and intervene in Somalia. And that wasn't obviously the best situation for the people or the U.S. military. And then she decided in 1994, when everybody was becoming a refugee and trying to get into the U.S., she decided to leave the U.S. and pack up her bags and take her two youngest children that were at home with her and her elderly mother and my father, and they all moved back to Somalia. And she went to her village and where she grew up as a child, and she hadn't seen this for many, many years. And the devastation that she saw in terms of the degradation of the land, the dryness of the area, she remembers fondly as a child. She has so many stories of being a pastoralist child and, you know, the grass being so high up to your knees as an adult, and go to the point where she talks of a story where a lion came into the homestead and her mother had to defend her, and fight off the lion using the fire and a stick from the fire to fight with the lion and scare the lion off, and eventually did leave. So these are the kinds of stories she told us. And then the devastation, she saw that all this grassland was now gone and the place was degraded and it was arid, and all these trees were getting cut for charcoal, which is called the black gold of Somalia. And this charcoal is exported to the Gulf and the Middle East, and this is what they use to smoke shisha in Dubai. The charcoal is the 400-year-old trees of Somalia, acacia trees of Somalia. Anyways, that's what eventually led her to start. She continued the work of the NGO. Instead of doing advocacy in the U.S., she now started working with communities around environment, degradation, education, and all of these things. I, on the other hand, finished my university, and I always knew what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to come back to Africa and help, but I never thought of myself as actually working with her. It wasn't actually part of my plan. My plan was to work with the UN. I, like everybody else, thought that the best job you could get was a UN job in development, humanitarian space. And so that's what I did. I came back to Nairobi, to Africa in 1999. And I've been away from the U.S. since then. And the first job I did get was with WFP and then later with IOM. And then in 2003, I decided to leave the UN and help her develop the organization because I could see she was struggling. I could see how she was getting treated by the international system. It was very humiliating. It was very undignified. It was just it was heartbreaking for me to watch. And so I said, I have to do my part to help her. So I left my good UN role and went from, a massive salary to nothing. And I came to Adeso and I looked in the books and then found out she wasn't even on salary, on payroll. From 1991 until 2003, when I joined, my mother was basically a volunteer running this organization. So I put her on payroll and her first salary was $1,000 a month. And then I tried to fundraise and I eventually found another $1,000 for myself after some time. And so that's when I started the journey working with Adeso. And then eventually she retired in 2006 and I took over as executive director. And I built this organization from $400,000 that it was our annual income to the height of Adeso being $27 million. But of course, we took a pivot and we can talk about that later. But so that's how I got into this work.
So you told me something that was actually very interesting about your mother. And her approach to working with the local community and changing the landscape and investing with local people so that they could grow their own food and make that part of Somalia green again. And you actually talked about how the development community treated that effort, where you were basically talking about giving people cash so that they can invest in themselves. And the development community was actually not interested in it at all till somebody from outside came and looked at the results. So can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So my mother basically, one of the major things she was able to accomplish through her advocacy, she's a charismatic speaker and leader and great public orator. And she was able to take her advocacy skills and start pushing the government and the local communities to stop charcoal and cutting down the trees, basically, to the point where she got the government of Puntland to finally put a law in the books to ban charcoal. That was the first law that, since the collapse and since the Civil War anywhere in the country, that banned charcoal. As a result of her advocacy efforts and the work that she was able to do with the communities, we also saw that there was community laws that were implemented that were traditional law that I think in some ways were more effective and impactful than the government law. And that's how she won the Goldman Environmental Prize, the Nobel in the environmental community, and subsequently a lot of other awards that she won for her work. So that was the first thing to stop the degradation, was to stop the charcoal. And then the second thing she did was she started doing a lot of physical land rehabilitation. So basically the rainwater would come and it would just flow in one direction with lots of power like water does. And it would never spread all over the grazing land and seep into the soil and therefore allow grass to grow. And so what she introduced is very small, low-tech technology, like putting rocks as a barrier to slow down the speed of the rainwater. And these rocks, they're sometimes called check dams or rock dams or whatever they're called, help reduce erosion and all of these things. And she was able, through this work, to get thousands and thousands of hectares of grazing land rehabilitated. And eventually, the pastoralists started doing some of these techniques themselves without it being an aid project. And she would go to the aid community and say to them, the root cause of these droughts and these humanitarian crises in these communities is the environment. And if you really want to, have a really sustainable solution to this problem of humanitarian crisis, you need to address the environment. So fund this work and allow us to scale it, or we're happy to train others so that it can go all over the country and all of that. And they said, no, Somalia is a humanitarian country. We're not interested in environmental programs, or at that time, nobody was using the terminology of climate change or anything like that. And so that's a development initiative. And we don't have development funding for Somalia. We only have humanitarian funding. So this, to me, was the first example of how the system was broken. I was like, wait a minute. If you're not going to address the root cause of the problem, you're going to continually spend a hell of a lot of money on Band-Aid solutions. Why are you, as a donor, willing to do that? And that's honestly how I got into this whole decolonizing aid agenda, because I realized maybe these donors really don't have our interest at heart. Maybe they don't want us to be self-reliant and not need them and not need aid. Then what happened was, in one of these droughts, so when I immediately joined, my first experience with Adeso was a drought situation where our education project involved doing a 1-month pastoral thing called the Camel Caravan, where the children who were taught during the school year now go and travel with pastoralists, and they collect data on certain issues. And during that year, the Camel Caravan, the children and the teachers found out there was a massive drought. And this drought led them to do an assessment, and they started asking questions around livestock numbers and all of that. And I turned that into a needs assessment, a pastoral drought assessment. And then I took that to the international community, being based in Nairobi, and I started doing advocacy, saying there's a drought, we need to respond. They dismissed our numbers. They dismissed our findings. They basically were like, I even had somebody in a public meeting say to me, your numbers can't be trusted. You're exaggerating. You're making up numbers around livestock deaths. And you just want money for your region, for your people. And I was honestly shocked, because coming from the UN, I had experienced unusual level of access and credibility that I didn't expect, to the point that I would go to my regional director, a white man from Denmark or Norway, I can't remember. And I would say to him, listen, I am not qualified as a 28-year-old to be in a meeting with a minister in Sudan. You should not be sending me to have these meetings. You should not be sending me to all of these high-level places. And the arrogance to expect that you as junior staff should be meeting with a minister in Africa, that was also another shock and aha moment. I didn't understand that. And I tried to resist that and reject that. Anyways, in the end, but also another thing I realized is that we not only did we have access, we were credible, we were trusted, nobody questioned and thought that you were lying and cheating or that you were potentially corrupt and all of that. Then I'm now placed in this local NGO role, and it's a complete 360-degree change. And now our numbers are not trusted, our information is not credible. And then we're potentially too risky and can't be trusted to spend money. Anyways, so then it became even more controversial, and cash was the response that my mother and the community on the ground and the team on the ground were recommending. They were like, these communities are pastoralists. The local economy is not longer working. We don't need food aid. The food aid that was coming from Wisconsin or Iowa or wherever was being fed to the animals. The people were not eating them because it was not culturally appropriate. They didn't have grinding machines. The UN was not giving them grinding machines to grind the grains. And they were just like, that's not what's needed. What we need is cash. And then I would go back and present this idea of cash. And then, if the reaction was even worse, like if your data was not credible, you're crazy now to think that we're going to now distribute cash in the middle of, quote unquote, conflict area. It was not a conflict area. There was no active conflict, but the country itself is painted as being, a conflict country. And, people are going to spend the money on drugs or guns. And so that was another battle that we had to fight. Eventually, we did get funding to do the first large-scale unconditional transfer that we documented through this article that we wrote in the ODI Humanitarian Practice Network journal. But it was difficult. It was really difficult and quite a shock to me coming from the UN. this entire experience. And I was like, oh, so this is now the reality of what it means to be a leader in for a local organization. It's extremely different, vastly different than working for the UN.
So today you are changing this dynamic and you're focused on proximate leadership. So in a short time that we have, share a little bit about the current work of Adeso in Africa.
We have been leading this movement since, I would say, around 2014. And when we were instrumental in the whole, what is now called the localization movement, quote unquote, which is basically around how do we move money proximately to local organizations in the aid system. It's also locally led development. It's also called decolonizing aid. There's different terminology, or proximate work. There's different terminology, but essentially it's about how do you move money and power and voice to local organizations. And we were the ones who suggested that a target be established, that the donors, the government donors, the US government, the Canadians, the British, all of these donor governments, that they have to establish a target for themselves of how much money practically they will move to local organizations. And this target was later part of this grand bargain initiative of all the OECD. It's called the OECD donors, so all the development donors. And that target was 25%. And we came up with that target. That was actually an advocacy target that we came up with that we were able to successfully get the donors to agree to. Then we founded and launched the Global South Civil Society Network, the first and only one that advocates for the interest of local organizations. And it's called the NEAR Network, NEAR. We founded them, we incubated them, and we launched them in 2016. And that network is now an active, thriving organization. We're still their fiscal sponsor, but they are very independent of us, and they will spin off from us next year. And so then we said, okay, now we have a Global South Advocacy Network. Now let's focus on practical solutions to the donors' problems of how to move money proximately. And so we have established a tech platform called Kuja, which means come in Swahili, where local organizations, it's like a LinkedIn for donors and local organizations to meet each other and to find each other, where you, sitting in Seattle, can do a search for potential partners to support in Kenya or in Palestine or wherever, and make connections with them and potentially support them and fund them. And then we are also working on another product of Kuja, which is for donors who talk about compliance and risk being a problem of why they can't fund locally. We have Kuja Build, which is basically a way we will provide the capacity for local organizations to outsource the back office that they usually find very difficult. And it's not difficult because they don't have the capacity. The difficulty is they don't have the resources to build that back office. It takes money and time to build that back office around finance, procurement, HR, which are usually the most non-compliant areas when an audit happens. So in the US, fiscal sponsors provide those services where local organizations can outsource that. That's not available in the Global South. So we want to bring that to the Global South, where organizations in Philippines or Uganda can outsource these back office systems, support functions to us. And then another thing we're working on that's Africa-focused, Kuja is a global platform, but Africa-focused is this initiative called the Proximate Fund. And that's trying to now address the other barrier where donors have said to us, okay, now I want to write a big check. I don't have the administrative capacity to manage a $25,000 grantee or a $50,000 grantee, like a Gates Foundation or even a bilateral donor like, FCDO or formerly USAID. So how do I move money proximately in that situation? And what we're saying is it's great that we have some really good values-aligned intermediaries, especially the feminist funds and groups like Global Fund for Children. But we would really love to have intermediation be as local as possible. The Proximate Fund is actually trying to develop a bunch of national funds in Africa that is led by civil society, governed by civil society with, compliance and bank accounts and all of that, so that if you're a donor, a high net worth individual or a foundation who wants to now fund the famine in Sudan, let's say, and support the organizations responding to that, then you can put money into the Sudan fund directly. They will have a fiscal sponsorship, and they can accept money from the US, UK, anywhere in the world. And they can re-grant at the Sudan level. And this is another thing. It's like we want to really decentralize the decision-making. It's not just moving the decisions from Seattle or London or DC to proximate, but it's also moving the decisions even further, because having a program officer in Kenya making decisions for Sudanese civil society, who to fund, what to fund, or Nigerian civil society, in my opinion, is inappropriate. Africa is not a country, it's a continent. And so we want the civil society in Nigeria to make decisions about who to fund and what to fund, and similarly in Sudan. So that's what the Proximate Fund would do. It would be a secretariat that would help with fundraising, compliance, back office, but really give a lot of autonomy to a bunch of funds all over the continent.
We can continue to have a 2-hour conversation. I would love to do a 2-hour conversation, which we hopefully will do with you for the book. But to end this, you've obviously lived a life of purpose. And purpose is really what drives you. It is the fire that keeps you going forward. Talk a little bit about why you believe purpose is important for all of us.
I think there's a difference between this work being a job as opposed to it being driven by a sense of, moral compass or responsibility. And that is, I think, purpose, and what purpose is. Because for me, I make decisions about what is good for the organization, not because it is financially sound decision. Sometimes it's not a good financial decision, meaning like shrinking the organization and saying, we're going to stop taking bilateral funding. That resulted in us shrinking from 27 million to less than 2 million, 340 staff to 15 staff. So for me, those are hard decisions that are made because of a sense of purpose, being driven by purpose and being driven by this very clear, I think, moral compass that we need to be serving the communities and being in service of the communities and not being in service of the donors. And when you have that clarity, I think it really removes a huge amounts of burden from you about making what some called outsiders say, oh my God, those are like really difficult, traumatic decisions. I don't see them as that. I honestly see them as fairly clear and easy decisions. Yes, the experience is a challenge. Yes, the path is difficult for sure, but the decision was not difficult. And so that's what purpose really means to me, is that it is the engine that drives my work and my vision for not just Adeso, but what the reforms and the changes that are needed in the sector, what they're about, is that sense of purpose that drives all of that. That's the heart and the engine of all of this.
Purpose is the engine that drives us forward, but it also allows you to make decisions. Degan, thank you so very much for being part of this conversation. Love having you, and I hope that we will get another opportunity to talk even more. Thank you so very much. Really appreciate your being part of the podcast.
Thank you for having me.